I guess to kind of kick a few things off, I guess like to kind of follow on from the talk of worship earlier, just to kind of talk about just expanding more on that phrase, the more we wait, the more God does. And the thing that we're waiting for in times of worship is God's presence. And so some of the things that we've learned so far from that, from waiting on God, is, and looking at the scriptures, of realizing that we're called to live a life of worship. We realize that, one, worship is our purpose. We were born to do this. We're born to live and breathe the praise of God. And I remember watching this, a guy called Rob Bell. Do you know him? A little bit controversial in the church world, but I'll say it anyway. He created these little videos, these little like 10-minute thoughts called Numas. And there was this one called Yahweh, or it's called Breathe. But he was basically, from studying the scriptures, just really played on this word Yahweh. And then kind of dove into, like, got some scientists involved, and actually they kind of found out that as you breathe in, the actual sound of it sounds like a yah, like a and then as you breathe out, what they kind of like translate it as is way. And so all these scientists were freaking out about it, and he suddenly just asked the question, what if our breathing, our very breath that we're doing thousands of times a day, is a very act of worshiping God. That as we're breathing in, yeah, as we're breathing out, way, like think how many times you breathe every minute. Think how many times you're praising. We're literally praising God with our breathing every day, every minute, every second. And so that kind of hit me and was like, going back to this point, worship is our purpose. And then secondly, worship is our priority, where, the biggest commandment in the Bible is love the Lord your God. And, that's what worship is. It's loving someone. It's adoring someone. It's wanting to be more like that person. And so worship is our highest priority. And back at our church, Soul Survivor, it's, our pastor always say, the reason we're here today, we're gathered, is for one reason, to worship him. And we're not going to let anything get in the way of that. If there's one thing we do today, it's worship him. So worship is our priority. And then worship is about his presence. It's about spending time with him, being with him. And kind of like unpacking that a bit more, a lot of people, you want to spend time in his presence and you want to hear from God. But I get a lot of people say, well, I do that quite a lot. Like, I spend time in the presence of God praying, but I just don't hear anything, so I give up. And what I try and encourage them to do is, in those moments where you're not, hearing things or feel like you're, hearing inklings of what he might be saying, is just to go to the Bible. And if you're like me, my Bible's got it's a simple Bible where it's got all the things that Jesus said in red. If you can't hear from God, you've only got to look at the Bible and just look at what he's saying, and you realize how relevant the words he says are still today. And you say them into your life, and that's when you're spending time in his presence. Just read them. You've got to read the Bible like a different book. Reading Harry Potter and stuff like that, it's a great story, Oh, interesting fact, this guy here has read Harry Potter, every flipping book, 27 times. Think how many hours he's wasted in his life. Like, that's stupid.
Can I just say that was between the ages of 7 and 13 as well? I haven't read them since I was 13.
Like, play computer games or something. Mario Kart, which has just come out on the iPhone.
It's a great investment.
It's a great game. It will take up a lot of your time. But anyway, what were we talking about? The presence of God. No, seriously, what were we talking about? Presence of God. Spending time reading the Bible. You got to read the Bible differently, because it's not just a book. It's a book that's alive. That the words on the page are alive. And once you start to read it differently, that those words just jump out at you. You can really hold on to these words and bring them into your life, and you will see that the presence of God follow you wherever you go. And so they're just kind of a few things really of just like, adapting these things. Just one, worship is a purpose. Worship is our priority. And worship is about his presence. They're kind of the things, 3 simple things that, daily I try to apply to my life. And I guess for us as worship leaders, as musicians, as worship teams, people who are passionate about worship, the question I always ask is, how can we, as a people of God, be a people of his presence? How do we carry him wherever we go? And by this I mean really, how do we as a people who are so in love with God become more and more like him, that we can't help but carry his presence wherever we go, that we are on fire for him. And as I get all of us up here, we get the privilege of visiting churches from outside our normal churches and just seeing what God's doing. And just to encourage all of you guys, something is happening here in the UK where we're seeing the presence of God interact in our times of worship and speak more than ever. And something's really happening, and there's this hunger, this openness that's happening. And I just want to encourage you, in all of your churches here in Bath or Bristol, wherever you may have come from, just to be open to what his presence wants to do, to give him the space, to give him the time to move. Don't be afraid of pulling back and just having silence. At first, when you try all those things, it's a little bit awkward, and you get a few people looking at you, but you've got to push through that and just see what he wants to do, because the more you wait, you'll start to see things starting to happen. And just a few little stories, that we started to see this summer as we allowed the presence of God to move in our times of worship. At the end, we saw this, I'll never forget it, we were walking out to go and get lunch, and there was saw this empty wheelchair at the back of the room, and there was a crowd of people not too far away from the wheelchair, but this lady had got up and walked out of her wheelchair, hadn't been able to walk for 10 years, told that she'd never be able to walk again without it being extremely painful. But she managed to walk to the other side of the room and then walk back. And as she walked back, she was walking towards her daughter. Her daughter was 8 years old and never seen her mum walk before. Can you imagine that? And in that meeting of just waiting in the presence of God, all that pain went away, that she started to walk, and she walked back pain-free again. And you saw her whole church around her cheering her on, just thanking God for everything he's done. And I'll never forget that, just seeing her family were in tears of happiness, just crying and crying, crying. All because the presence of God was in the room. And the reason why I go on about this so much, the presence of God, is because that's got to be our destination in worship. Our destination shouldn't be to get everyone's hands in the air, to kind of stick to our plan and to ignore if God's speaking, but to be open to what he wants to do, because there are life-changing stories that we've got to see firsthand of God at work. as we allow him to speak. And there was another one, obviously I said the one about that guy and his scars being healed, they're all completely gone. There was another lady who had no feeling in her right arm. She hadn't had any feeling at all. She was completely healed. It was the first time she'd ever, for I think 4 years, felt her hand, that she had no feeling in her hand. She had a nasty ski accident, and she was completely healed. And again, it's all in the presence of God. As we worshipped, as we lifted him high, he comes down. He meets us where we're at. Another one where one of the guys who was speaking brought one of his team members, and she was completely blind in one eye. And then during the time of worship, she came up and she could start to see outlines of people again through this eye. And then as she started to give the testimony, she started to see more and more and more. And then as she went down to worship, she started to see colors again out of this eye that she'd been blind in her whole life. And then I think by 2 or 3 days later, her sight had fully come back. And it was just like, you hear all these stories and you're just like, I just want to give my life to this, to seeing the Spirit of God move in power. And that's our role as worship leaders, is just to follow him. We've got to learn how to follow him before we can lead others. And I think there's some little encouragements for us as we just kind of open up a bit of conversation about it, and just maybe talk about if we've got any stories about being in the presence of God. I know Ashtyn's got something to say, so why don't you expand from here?
Yeah, that was great. I think ultimately when we lead worship, and when we're worship leaders or we're musicians, ultimately our responsibility is to press into God and to press into our relationship with God. And what I always say to our worship teams back in London, and since I've come to move to Leicester, is ultimately you should be able to lead yourself in worship. In your room, you should be able to sit there and talk to God and lead yourself in songs when you're making set lists and when you're pressing into God, because ultimately we're leading people in worship, but ultimately we rely on the Holy Spirit. So we rely on God to take us. And if we're not relying on the Holy Spirit, and if we're not pressing into God ourselves, we can't take people where we've never been. And ultimately we don't want it to be a talent show, or we don't want it to be a performance. We want it to be ultimately filled with God's presence and the Spirit of God. And as these guys were saying earlier, the more we wait, the more he does. But if we're not filled with the Holy Spirit, and if we're not aware of the Holy Spirit in our secret place, what are we going to wait for? Leading worship, it comes out of, if we let's cancel out the idea of relationship and law, and let's go into the idea of relationship and grace, because religion is what holds us down, but relationship is what presses us into God's presence, and let us rely more on his grace and his mercy than we rely on the rules and regulations, because ultimately pressing into the love of God is what will overflow us to actually do the actions. And if we're so compelled by the love of God, if we're pressing into the Bible, we're pressing into the Spirit of God in our secret place, it will result to actions. It will result to caring for people more. It will result to the actions of the kingdom of God, of what God's calling us into. And ultimately, I feel like sometimes we live as orphans, we live as slaves, and we live as slaves to the world and relying on what people think of us, and we're not actually living as sons and daughters of God, and our identity lies with Christ. And if we're missing parts of that, that's when the idea of self-worth creeps in, because we then think it's all about us. But ultimately, it's about God, and by showing it's about God, is pressing into him in our bedrooms, and when we don't have a platform, or we're not on a platform, that's when we can worship most freely because we're unaware of the attention that's around. And maybe you got one parent, maybe you got two parents, maybe you got a carer, maybe you've got family around. But ultimately, if you think about your family dynamic, your family don't love you because you do good. Your family don't love you because of the rules and things that they've set in place. You don't get back on time. They're not going to love you any less. And it's the same with God. And God's never going to love you any less for leading a bad worship set or for not pressing into the Bible more. And these things are as a result of his love. And there's this, I was speaking at youth yesterday, and it was so last minute, so I made like an acrostic to help the youth. But it spells love, and the first one is live in community. So I think I would only have my faith, and I'd only be able to do this worship journey if I have people around me that are pressing into God, and I look to my left and right and I see people running the race with Jesus together. And Joel over there, he's my boss now, so throw things at him after. But he's my boss, and I don't think I would be able to keep striving if I didn't have people around me like Joel or like Tom and Dan and the guys, because ultimately we keep each other focused, and we are the church. We are what is going to be the future. If there's no buildings, we are still the church. Second is obey God. As Tom was talking about obedience and when he got a prophetic word, small things like that are a response to loving God. And when God tells us to maybe read the Bible, let us try to press into that, read the Bible. It's a relationship. Who doesn't want to learn about their parents more, learn their parents' secrets? It's pressing into the relationship with God. V stands for vocalize Jesus. Maybe you're a sports fan or you have hobbies, but ultimately we always tell people about the good things that are happening in our lives. We always tell people about the high points about our lives and maybe the low points. But ultimately, if we're so compelled and overwhelmed by the Spirit of God and by our relationship with God, we want to tell people. And I had a few people when I was doing a seminar recently say, "Oh, but I'm not called to be an evangelist." But ultimately, if you're happy about Jesus and if you love what you do in worship, leading, or music, you want to tell people about Jesus because that's who it's all about. And E stands for earnestly pray and be honest with God. Sometimes I always get into the idea that I can pretend with God. I can pray, "Our Father who art in heaven," like a really, really borderline strict prayer. But actually inside I'm feeling super mad at God because something's happened in my day or something's happened in my week. Ultimately, he already knows what's going on in our heart. He already knows what's going on in our head. And he just wants to know. He just wants to have that conversation to show his love. And so all of that is out of the idea of love. And we only tell people about Jesus. We only lead worship, and we only listen to God because we love him and he first loved us. He didn't send his son to give us rules and regulations. He sent his son for us to have an outward experience and lead people in worship in our everyday life. And you can lead worship as much on stage as you can off stage with your friends and your loved ones. So, yeah.
It's good, man. It's awesome. And I guess to kind of take it from that, like, question would be good to ask you guys is just got me thinking, how, as we're leading worship, as we're playing, how do we recognize the presence of God? How do we know whether it's God or whether it's just, someone just looking at you going, shaking and waving or something like that? And it's, how do you discern what's God and what's not? We get to get your guys' thoughts on this. Even like this morning, I shared a room with Dan last night, which is lovely. And woke up this morning, he was reading Harry Potter. He was reading the Bible. So holy, Daniel. But the passage you were reading was like, suddenly jumped off the page, didn't it? Of like, we had this moment in the summer. It was the last ever evening of Soul Survivor festivals. And as we got up, it had been pure sunshine the whole week. Like, do you remember that ridiculous heat wave that was like, melted the UK? And there wasn't one drop of rain. There wasn't, all day hadn't said there was going to be any rain. And then as we started, we got up out of nowhere. This thunderstorm had been rolling in and literally just appeared over our big top tent with like 10,000 kids in. And as we got up to say, hey, welcome to the last ever, we suddenly just got interrupted by this humongous, the loudest thunderstorm I've ever heard in my life, where I think the lightning struck one of the poles in the tent and it took out all the power to the screens and
We lost
everything.
the projectors.
We lost the projectors. It started raining, so it was flooding everywhere. People were screaming. It literally was the end of the world. And it was like, what the heck is going on? Like, where did this come from? And it was the loudest thunderstorm I think I've ever heard in my life. It was like scary. It shook the tent, like the sound. It literally saw the tent ripple from one end to the other end, and it was like, that passage in the Bible, fear God. In this moment, it was like, oh my goodness, I'm so scared right now. It's true. And then you were reading this thing today. Why didn't you say a bit about that in the passage?
Yeah, so I was just reading John 12 in the Message version this morning, and this just like really jumped out at me. And then for some reason, like that whole storm situ in end of week B came to mind. And it's basically just this passage where Jesus says, if any of you wants to serve me, then follow me. Then you'll be where I am, ready to serve at a moment's notice. The Father will honor and reward anyone who serves me. Right now, I'm storm-tossed, and what am I going to say? Father, get me out of this? No, this is why I came in the first place. I'll say, Father, put your glory on display. A voice came out of the sky. I have glorified it, and I'll glorify it again. The listening crowd said, thunder. Others said, an angel spoke to him. Jesus said, the voice didn't come for me, but for you. At this moment, the world is in crisis. Now Satan, the ruler of this world, will be thrown out, and I, as I'm lifted up from the earth, will attract everyone to me and gather them around me. And I just think that's like so powerful. Like, we can often see, I guess, like normal everyday things as just being like, dismiss it as, oh, that's just thunder, or oh, that's just, someone crying in the corner or whatever. But it's like sometimes that can be God moving in our midst or God speaking to us. So I guess like look for the supernatural in the ordinary everyday things. And going back to what Ashtyn was saying as well, you need to like, if you want to be able to identify the presence of God in a corporate setting when you're leading worship or when you're around others, you've got to be able to know his voice in the private place. You've got to know him on your own before you're able to lead others in that. So yeah, Mike always says as well, like sometimes it's not like, hear ye, I'm God, like, listen up, guys. Like it's more often that those like niggling little thoughts, just like, oh, is that you, Lord, or is that indigestion, And it's like, often it's the Lord, but if we step out and try and just be obedient, it's like, sometimes we can just be looking out and it's like, oh, there's a real gentleness, God's peace is here. Or there's a real joy, or there's a real sense of celebration of all he's done for us. That helps us just like lead the room in worship. So just be sensitive to what you're seeing and go for it.
How about you, Joel? Like, how would you, when you're worship leading and, just in everyday life, how do you discern what is the Spirit of God moving? And in those moments, what do you do?
Hey guys. What's it for me? I don't know if I think the more you lead worship, the more you start to try and walk a relationship with God. And sometimes the less you think about almost what you're doing. But what I do think about is I'm always looking for, Lord, give me keys to unlock the hearts of the people in the room. So I don't really, I feel like, I kind of have this opinion that God is God, he is sovereign, he is moving. I don't need to help him do that. But I do think often as worship leaders, it is our job to help the people get to that place. And so I guess for me, I would always be praying, Lord, give me keys for people's hearts. Give me keys so that they can say yes. So that, what we are doing here is, basically leading people into the presence of God and leading them in worship, because hopefully we can sing roughly in tune and play a guitar and they can't. We're trying to lead people in that way. I remember there's a really cool Jeremy Riddle quote where he said, sometimes I talk to worship leaders and they're really frustrated because their congregations don't just get it. They don't just understand that Jesus is great. But he's like, actually for most of us worship leaders, what we need to realize is we don't actually have a role in heaven. When God's standing there, you don't need to go, look how great he is. He's there and everyone can see him. But right now it is our job to lead people into worship. And so I guess my encouragement to you would be, as you're leading, pray for keys for people's heart, whether it's a song, whether it's leaving space, whether it's, so I've seen clips of, people like Martin Smith will get other people to sing bits, and, it's got to be what's right for you, but it's probably less, for me, it's less asking, it is asking, Lord, what are you doing? But it's also saying, Lord, what can I do so that people are more open to you? Maybe that's just a slightly different take.
Yeah. That's really good. And just on this, it'd be great to hear from you guys. If you've got any questions, I think we've got a little mic to go around. There we go. Yes, over there.
Hi. I lead worship at my church. I've been leading for a year maybe. I'm not sort of on the regular. I sort of maybe do it once or twice a month. But I really struggle to get a natural natural break in between songs. It feels like it's almost sort of, we've done with this song, now we've finished. What do you guys do that gives it that kind of natural flow that doesn't make it like a karaoke session, that makes it like a proper time to have that space in between songs?
Yeah. Just on as something we try and do, I know not every worship team, every church has its own worship culture, but for something in my church, a real key thing to our worship is the flow, and just allowing songs to flow from one to the other, and not getting in the way of that. So, because it can sometimes distract, it can sometimes feel like, okay, that stopped, start again, stop, start again, and it's like you can't actually progress as much as if you were to flow. So just on a practical note, today, we kept all the songs in the same key, and just what we were able to do is you've got instruments like the keyboard and the guitars that can really help fill in those gaps. So it's not just this awkward silence of stop, start again, but actually you're able to flow from song to song in that way as well, and just not being afraid of starting songs differently as well. The song doesn't have to be like it is on the record, but actually, now and again start with the chorus of the song, mix it up a bit, and just I think that helps lead people, draws people in a lot more. Any of you guys got anything to add?
Yeah, I think different worship leaders will lead in a different way, and in terms of how I lead and how I listen to God is after a song. I think you have moments where you flow, and you have moments where you're playing over the chord progression, and ultimately it's like your band being prepared enough to actually finish the song and know what chord progression you're playing over. And ultimately it says in the Bible a word called selah, which means a pause, and that's a break in maybe singing, that's a break in maybe the music, and ultimately letting, music is powerful, so playing over people is super powerful. And a big part of why people get healed as well is music being powerful. And after a song, sometimes I flow from the first to the second, and sometimes God stops me in my track on the second. And I mean, I led worship at last Sunday, and God knows how long we were going over a progression. Ultimately, I'm looking around the room, and I'm like, I don't feel God is saying to move on from this song, because the chords are playing and people are meeting with God. And in that point, people can lead themselves in worship. There's worship leaders in the room that are praying for people. There's things happening in the room. So I take a pause and I take a Selah moment where I'm like my voice is powerful, but ultimately for this moment, the band behind me are as powerful. God is using the band behind me. So yeah, like making sure your band know the songs, and after a song, you get third, fourth song in, maybe you don't need to go silent. Maybe you can go silent. Maybe you keep going over the chorus chords or the bridge chords or areas like that.
How do you know when you're ready to like start doing worship at your church rather than just yourself? Like, how do you know when you've kind of got to that point with God where you think you can help lead other people?
In terms of like helping lead worship, get involved more that way, I think like it's hard as worship leaders. Like, we don't want to push ourselves forward. It kind of goes against everything that we sing and we preach. We pray for God to open those doors. I know I do. I guess it's all kind of in, like for me, I started just in my youth group leading worship, and then someone asked me to lead worship at church alongside them. And the first time, what actually happened was I was just up there with my guitar. My guitar wasn't plugged in, and it was plugged in, but the tune it pedal was on the whole time, and my mic wasn't on either, and just got like experience of what it's like to be in front of people, leading people that way. But I guess the kind of language you want to kind of say to people, like, because do you lead worship yourself? No, but is it something you're feeling more and more called into? I guess it's finding someone that you really trust and you look up to, and saying, look, I think this might be something God's calling me to. I don't know where to start. Is there anywhere I can help serve, get involved, and learn that way? I've done that for a couple of guys on our team who've come to me and said, I'd love to learn more about leading worship. And is there anything I can do to serve, just to be around and learn more? And one thing we get them involved in is the visuals, putting the lyrics on the screen. And because in a way, they're leading people in worship just as much as you, where they're providing people with the lyrics so that people can sing, just as the worship leaders providing, the words for people to sing. And so, and the melody. And very quickly they learn kind of the heart of worship, what this is all about, and how, the bigger picture, being a team player, and learning from each other, especially I'll get them to come to band rehearsals as well and just see how we run a rehearsal, how we speak to our band. But I think, find someone that you trust. Tell them that I think this might be something God is calling me to. I'd love to learn more. Is there anyone you think I can team up with and just follow for a little bit? Like, I followed Tim Hughes around, carried his guitar for a year. So if you fancy carrying Ashtyn's guitar for a year, I know he'd like that. But just, find someone that you trust that is for you as well. I think that's where you start, and just see what doors God opens. It's exciting.
Also, just to add to that, I think the idea of getting involved in serving is awesome. But there's a thing I say, it's progress over perfection and improving on your craft. And if you play an instrument that you can lead from, like keys or guitar or another instrument that you can lead worship from, keep improving on that craft. God is not asking for it to be perfect, but God's asking, if you're not, I always say to myself, if I'm not improving every Sunday, I'm missing the point. So I'm not gonna kill myself to actually get the best in the world, but I'm gonna keep working hard to be the best I can be. Vocally, I still get singing lessons. So does Joel, and Joel can sing in crazy keys. So, yeah, keep improving on your Justin Bieber still gets singing lessons. So it shows it's progress over perfection for him as well. So the idea of keep improving your instrument, keep improving your craft, and it's not so you look good or you sound good. That's part of it, but it's just so you're not a distraction to the congregation. We've all been in rooms where the worship leader can't sing or play guitar or stuff, or the drummer's out of time and stuff like that, but we actually have to keep pressing into progressing, getting better.
Also, just to really quickly add, you never arrive, you're never qualified. There's not a moment where you pass the test and you're suddenly released to go and do ministry. It's we're always learning. We're all still learning, and it goes back to what I was saying earlier about how God doesn't call the equipped; He equips the called. So if it's something you feel like you want to press into, then chat to people keep learning your instrument, and go for it. Basically, just try that door.